Welcome to the RSP Film and Theory. Adam Harstad and Matt Waldman with you today. We're going to talk a little bit about player archetypes. Anthony Richardson probably as kind of the starting part of that subject, and the kind of the farcical nature of the whole tap out narrative. Something I talked a little bit about with Brandon Angelo last night on our Going Deep podcast. I'd like to get Adam's thoughts on that. And the fine line between communicating confidence and certainty with analysis. And of course, that's kind of a lot about what Adam's talking about in his work, about what qualifies as good work in the industry when it comes to fantasy analysis and football analysis. I would say it extends to that as well. So just to begin, let's just start with kind of the farcical nature of this tap out narrative, just to kind of get things warmed up here. As Brandon and I were talking about this, Adam, it occurred to me that everyone in the NFL who was actually playing with him as a teammate, Zaire Franklin kind of said it best on his podcast, and other players kind of said it best, is he should have just lied. Should have just lied and said, I'm not, I had the wind knocked out of me or something like that. Which kind of made me laugh, because the people who were denigrating him were former players who are espousing this warrior mentality, which, again, it's a collision sport. It's a punishing sport. Like many collision physical sports, it does border on a level of combat to a degree, but the warrior mentality doesn't extend to like what our veterans have had to do. There's a line, and to me, I find this whole thing kind of farcical, that a player who's like literally shrugging off 300-pound linemen on a basis at a rate that he really shouldn't have to, at the level of what he's doing, is as athletically gifted as him and was pressured as much as him. He just thought it was pretty much a given to be able to be honest and say, hey, I needed a breather on this 3rd and 23 in the third quarter in a moment of the game that really wasn't going to be life or death to us. And I honestly think that, if you look at his archetype, which we'll talk about later, it's guys like Josh Allen, Steve McNair, Terry Bradshaw, John Elway, physical freak players within their generation who Cam Newton, who took a lot of punishment. And if a guy like that is like, listen, I've already had to deal with, enough of what I was doing that I'm not going to be helpful to the team in that moment, I don't see an issue with that, like, at the end of the day. But it makes me laugh that we celebrate players, not us probably, but a lot of people they market the game to celebrate players and make them heroes. But but we're also they're all encouraging them to lie. And I think it's kind of funny that the guy who probably is the least vulnerable physically at that position on a level of the kind of punishment that he takes thought it was just a given that he could say, no one's going to worry about me tapping out. What's the big deal about that? And everyone made the biggest deal about it possible.
Yeah, I always think, and this, people love like making normative statements. We have our ideas of what a football player should look like, what their interests should be, what their personality should be, and we love to punish players who deviate from that ideal. Arian Foster marched to the beat of different drum, and he talked about that a lot. That like, okay, yeah, I'm interested in vegetarianism and veganism. I'm interested in meditation, right? I'm not going to be like this crazy rage monster at all times. I want to like get my zen, and teams have held that against me at times. Who was the guy at FSU ages ago who got like a Rhodes Scholarship, and he was like a top, Myron Roll, right?
Myron Roll, yeah.
He was a top football prospect, and he got a Rhodes Scholarship, and this is like a once in a lifetime opportunity to go study, in this expenses paid
neuroscience, I think.
Right. and he, okay, he's going to take a year or two off football and come back, and he said that, like, I felt like NFL teams effectively blackballed me at that point, or not blackballed me, but they were questioning my commitment to the game, as if like it's not just a job. And I think soccer is much more open about this, where you'll get soccer players who are like, soccer is a job. This is what I do from 9 to 5. This isn't my personality. This isn't my life. I happen to be extraordinarily good at it. I happen to work really hard at it and take pride in it, but this is a job. This is not my identity. And you don't get, like, football players, they get punished if football is not their identity.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if they're working hard at it. It doesn't matter if they're being professional and treating it as a craft and taking it seriously. We want these normative statements, like, it has to be your identity. You have to behave in a certain way. And we've kind of always been like this. I mean, like, think about Cam Newton and all the talk about how, his team's losing by 14 and he's making a joke and smiling on the sidelines. And it's like, what do you want him, like, anointing his head with ashes and tearing his jersey in repentance on the sideline?
Yeah.
Like Dick Vermeil cried during press conferences. Tony Dungy never raised his voice, and they were extremely successful despite defying this archetype of coach as like this John Gruden-esque raging tyrant. There's room for a lot of different types and makeups to succeed. And further, I would say by the time you've made it to the NFL and by the time you've been drafted high and you've gotten through competitive high-level college play, like, there have been a lot of selective filters prior to getting to this point. So any traits that still exist, they're probably pretty adaptive. Odell Beckham, people gave him a hard time because he's like being a diva on the sidelines, so to speak, and he's like kissing that field goal net, and he's, whatever, being a goofball and wanting attention. And it's like, do you think Odell Beckham would be as good of a receiver as he is today if he didn't want attention? Yeah. Like, why are we not talking about Antonio Brown, who at the time led the NFL in post-touchdown taunting celebrations? That's obviously him wanting attention. Antonio Brown wanting to be the center of attention probably didn't make him a very fun guy to hang around with, but it absolutely made him the wide receiver that he was. That kind of trait was adaptive for how he played the game and how he succeeded. And Cam Newton, being relatively, nonplussed on the sideline when things weren't going his way, that was probably one of the things that made Cam Newton as good as he was in the way that he was. Anthony Richardson being so concerned about like his ability to physically execute at any given time is probably why Anthony Richardson is able to physically execute as often as he does. So yeah, I'm not really interested in like what should he have done, what shouldn't he have done. I'm interested in, was this decision adaptive for him at the time? And I'm not one to say that it wasn't. Good for him for making a call and saying, I think that it's better for me and for my team now if I take this play off, rather than trying to gut through it because of other people's ideas of what I should be or what I shouldn't be or how I should feel. So yeah, it's a tempest in a teapot, if you ask me. I'm never a fan of this saying how players should be.
Yeah, I kind of laugh about it because there's also I wonder how much bias is into that too, because I think about Jared Allen made a big fuss whenever he celebrated. Nobody seemed to make a big deal about that. Mark Gastineau had a whole show for many years basically doing that. George Kittle's an absolute goofball if you go listen to him. And, I wonder what would have happened if a player reported, what happens if Joe Montana loses the Super Bowl against the Bengals where he pointed out John Candy? Or, and what happens if it was Cam Newton who did that and they lost? Would we have heard about that he was distracted during the most important moment of the game rather than using it as a psych-out ploy of leadership to get people loose? People misunderstood that? Would we have former players railing against him? Because, I laugh. Brian Baldinger is such a respected guy on Twitter and a former player, and he does great work. He would not hear anybody trying to debate him about Anthony Richardson and what he did. Just was was rude about shutting people down. I'm reading it, I'm going, wow. This is near and dear to you. But I think for a lot of these players, it is near and dear to them because they've had to put so much work into getting to where they were, and they also probably bought into the company man mentality of this is how I have to be, this is how I've got to get there, this is how I've got to stay there, and embracing that quote unquote warrior mindset to a detriment. And where that leads, if you ask me, is it's unintentional, but unintentional what it leads to is players sitting in a darkened room, not being able to function in their lives at the end of that, at the end of their careers, and hoping that the NFL will pay them their compensation, and maybe to get more compensation for their aftercare, for with what's going on. And it's like, is that where we want? That's not where we want it all to lead. We want, that's why but we lionize the people who make those types of sacrifices for their team.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think on some level, I feel like everybody's ideal is either exactly like them or the exact opposite of them, right? And so if you were like the guy who gave it all and like laid it all on the line and sacrificed so much, I feel like you're either going to love the players who are exactly like that, or you're going to love the players who are just completely different. Like there's the story about Billy Beane with the Oakland A's, and he was like this player who had all of the physical tools and all of the hype and whatever, but he just could never put it together. And it's talking about how like on the A's he really loved the misfits, the guys who like had none of the physical tools, none of the hype, but they had all of these conceptual tools and they were able to succeed. And so he basically gravitated towards players who were the exact opposite of him as a prospect.
Yeah.
Like I love Arian Foster, guys like Foster, Marshawn Lynch, Cam Newton, because I see a lot of myself in them. I think like this is the way that I live, and it's made me very happy, and this is the best way I know how to live. And when I see that reflected in NFL players, I always think that's really cool. But had I been in the league and had I sacrificed what a lot of these former players had sacrificed, I very well might find it disrespectful.
Yeah, and I certainly admire that folks want to, uphold a certain standard, and I understand the depth of feeling that a guy like Brian Baldinger would feel, and a lot of former players would feel, even if I think some of these former players are being disingenuous because they're on TV and they got to get paid to. They're getting paid to make a tempest in a teapot more than they are to actually be genuine about this issue. But I think some of them legitimately believe that that this was something you don't do. But the solutions that are being offered make me laugh, because it's like, okay, so we drape ourselves in the NFL in patriotism. We have them pay, but though they pay them to put on patriotic displays, but they want to drape themselves in the flag. They want to drape themselves in what they think American values are. And then the American value they want to promote the most is probably the one that we all hate the most, is lies, is to lie. So I just find it a fascinating thing. And certainly, lying is a complicated thing on a level of like, you can understand where people lie out of convenience or hide truth out of convenience, or maybe it's not the time to share a certain truth with people. And then and you can look at people like that and say it's more complicated. It's not, it's not as simple to tell the truth all the time. But it is certainly something to aspire to. And I think that it's, so I find it humorous that, that it's like, but and from a realistic standpoint, rather than being idealistic about it all, I mean, NFL players have been coached before they get into the league a lot about, you want to lie to the media as much as you can about things, because they're not here to like print a kind, simple truth. They're here to exploit you for clicks and dollars and advertising revenue.
Yeah. I think it's really important to understand the nature of relationships. It's like if you're at a big company and you have an HR department, that HR department, they want to make it seem like they're there to serve you. They're not. They're there to serve the company. They're not your friend. You don't want to go and confide in HR. They're absolutely, if it comes down to it, going to side against you and for the company and use whatever you told them against you. And so, yeah, absolutely, don't. You have to know the nature of the relationship. And I do think that this was an example of him not understanding the nature of the relationship.
Yep.
And I think it will be a big learning experience for him in that respect.
Yeah.
But in terms of, does it matter for him as a player? Look,
Nah.
now, if he can make plays, nobody's going to care. If he can't make plays, nobody's going to care.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Exactly. And I think his teammates know they didn't really care about all that as much. So, speaking of him and get into this, I was looking at our Football Guys message board earlier this week, and I saw that Jason Wood had looked at a list from StatHead and decided to see who were players that fit a certain statistical criteria that matched what Anthony Richardson has or hasn't done well. And he had a long list of players, and the only two players that I think stood out were Terry Bradshaw and John Elway. And so, as he was making remarks about maybe Occam's razor is that, Anthony Richardson just isn't that good, and that might be the simplest explanation. I also thought about, when I look at that list, it's kind of like comparing apples, kumquats, raisins, and and anvils, and maybe instead I would rather take a look at all the anvils that were on that list. And the three anvils I saw were Richardson, Bradshaw, and Elway, in the sense that they, as I alluded to earlier, they stood out as players in their generation who had elite athletic traits above and beyond most players in their era at that position. So I guess what I wanted to ask you is, do you find, when you look at lists like what Jason brought up, do you find value in something like that? Or would it make more sense, or do you find extra value or no value at all by saying, let's filter it by archetypes where these players are similar in fashion, so that we can kind of create a model based on the player archetype, and see where that development goes? Because to me, like, comparing Anthony Richardson with Bubby Brister doesn't really make any sense, so, for me. But if I were to look at Lamar Jackson, Cam Newton, Josh Allen, Terry Bradshaw, and John Elway, I would say that's a list from a prospect standpoint that I would compare just based on physical ability as throwers, as movers in the pocket, as runners, with high-end athletic skills. And because to me, I guess my example would be, these players need more latitude to test out their skills because they're so used to being able to make one-of-one plays on a football field physically that few can. And they've even shown it in the NFL, but not maybe to the degree of consistency yet. And they make mistakes conceptually trying to figure out what they can and can't get away with. So, like the example I used last night was Muhammad Ali is a boxer with rope-a-dope. Nobody did rope-a-dope before him, but as a heavyweight, he was so quick. He had the quickness of a welterweight as a heavyweight, and that was unheard of at that time. So he was able to use his skills in a manner where he knew he could use his skills in a manner to push the envelope of what was sane, even beyond what other people in the profession thought made no sense, and was able to win that way. And I think that's similar to what we see with certain players. And when you look at a certain archetype, those players had to kind of figure that out. So I guess that's my argument for why I think I find it valuable, but I wonder if you think it's valuable, or you think that's all just narrative and bias moving forward.
Yeah, first on the subject of Richardson's benching, so at the end of the day, if Richardson is 5 years from now the exact same quarterback he is today, that's not a good outcome, right? He doesn't have a long career in the league if he stays exactly where he is right now. If Jaden Daniels is the same quarterback 5 years from now that he is today, he doesn't have a long career in the league either. For players like Daniels, Richardson, what matters is not what they are right now. What matters is what can they develop into, and will they continue to develop? And I've seen a lot of this belief that players can only develop when they're in the game, and that the problem is we've only seen players develop in the game because we have a rookie wage suppression system that makes it maximally advantageous to put your rookies out earlier. Like, that's in the team's best short-term interest. But we have tons of examples from history of players developing just fine on the bench. Phillip Rivers, Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes sat almost his entire rookie year. I think they were better in their first starts and their first seasons as a starter because they had that time on the bench. I don't think players remain stagnant just because they're not getting in the game. So will the Colts continue to try to develop Anthony Richardson? Absolutely. If they're successful at that, he's going to have a long career. If they're unsuccessful at that, not going to have a long career. That's the same whether he's in the game or not. So to me, I'm not really losing sleep over whether he's benched or not. You could say it's a negative indicator, but we saw his play on the field. We've seen the things to draw our own conclusions without having to rely on these second order indicators. In terms of creating models in historical comps, I do a lot of that. And I find there's value in it. But I also write somewhat frequently that, like, there's a lot of danger in it too. There's this famous painting by a guy named Rene Magritte, where it's just a picture of a pipe, and underneath it says, "This is not a pipe." And, like, people got so mad when this when this painting was displayed in museums, and they're like, "It's a pipe! It's a pipe! Why is he saying it's not a pipe?"
He's actually my favorite artist, and we have several paintings of or
I love
prints of
Magritte.
his
I love it.
all over our house.
But yeah, people are mad. They're like, "It's a pipe! It's a pipe! What nonsense are you talking?" He's like, "Oh, okay. Can you stuff it with tobacco and smoke it? I'd like to see you go ahead and try it. It's a pipe. Go ahead and take it, put it in your pipe case. Is it a pipe? No, it's a representation of a pipe." The point he's making is that a representation of a thing is not the thing that it represents. And that's, I think, a very important lesson to keep in mind when doing this historical modeling. So you say, for instance, you're creating this historically comparable pool of players for Anthony Richardson. And it includes Lamar Jackson, John Elway, Cam Newton, Terry Bradshaw, whoever it includes. And based on that, the average outcome from this group was X. Now, if we imagine a counterfactual universe where John Elway ruptured his Achilles in his very first season, that comparable pool of players is going to look like it had worse outcomes. But the reality is, John Elway rupturing his Achilles 30 plus years ago, 40 years ago, does not make it less likely that Anthony Richardson develops into a good player today. I don't know if people realize this. These are actually different players. Like, Anthony Richardson is not actually John Elway. He doesn't have some percentage of John Elway's spirits, and the outcome of John
horse
Elway's
teeth, or
right,
absolutely, yeah, exactly.
His pathological need to win at ping pong,
his hatred of Cleveland.
Absolutely. Well, did Elway hate Cleveland, or did Cleveland hate Elway? I think we got the arrow.
We don't care. We just hate him. That's all right. Anyway.
Yeah, it's important to remember that the bad point about historical comps is they're obvious nonsense, and it's trivially easy to prove that they're nonsense. That it's all just like hocus pocus with absolutely no basis in reality. And the only redeeming factor I've ever been able to find is that despite being nonsense, they do kind of work. They do actually lead to. So it's voodoo, but it kind of works. So I'll go ahead and engage it in anyway. That's fine. So yeah, I really like historical comps. I do a lot of historical comps, despite constantly writing that, like, it's important to know that what I'm doing here is voodoo. You are correct that this is all nonsense. You're not wrong, but it works. Sometimes, often, if you do it well, if you do it carefully. I do love sorting into archetypes. And I did this last year with Bryce Young, and I said, look, here's the list of quarterbacks who were as inefficient in their rookie year as Bryce Young, right? Like, only 10% of these guys wind up going on to have good careers. Here's that same list, except I've only looked at the guys who were very high draft picks, right? It doesn't matter that, like, Max Hall or John Skelton was terrible as a rookie. It's like a 6th round draft pick. It doesn't matter. No offense to Max Hall. Max Hall was probably never going to be the next great quarterback. So here's the same list where I'm only looking at guys who are very high draft picks. Now all of a sudden, like 33 to 40% of these guys wound up going on to be pretty good. Donovan McNabb, John Elway, Troy Aikman, Terry Bradshaw, lots of examples of very high draft picks who started very early and struggled and turned it around. Now, I'm not saying that it's good that Bryce Young was playing bad. There's lots of examples of high draft picks who struggled early, and that was because they were just not good quarterbacks. You look at like Jamarcus Russell and the like. But it's important to get that accurate list of comps, and that's the hardest part and the thing that's easiest to screw up. But it's also dangerous when you're searching for the right list of comps. The more degrees of freedom an analyst has, the more choices that they can make about what they're going to look at, the more potential sources of bias they can introduce, the more places they have to insert, to editorialize rather than analyze. And so, for instance, if I'm approaching this question from the position that I think Anthony Richardson is going to be a good quarterback in the long run, and I'm deciding who qualifies as a valid comparison for Anthony Richardson, I'm going to be biased towards excluding guys who I know did not become good quarterbacks and including guys who I know did become good quarterbacks. And often we'll have very good and sound reasons for doing so when in reality, subconsciously they're all pretextual. Like, we're not doing it because that's where the analysis leads us. We're doing it because that creates our preferred narrative. In scientific studies, this is known as p-hacking or the garden of forking paths. And it's a big reason why the vast majority of scientific studies, and especially highly cited scientific studies, just stopped replicating for a long time, because everybody had their preferred outcome. And they didn't realize that with all of the freedom they had and the choices they could make in terms of study design, you could get your preferred outcome every time, whether it was true or not. So that's the danger, I would say, with creating.
Yeah, and before you move forward, I think it's important to underscore that something like the example I gave, I would say it would be important to look, what you're looking for are players who are athletic, who have a certain high degree of athletic ability, bigger than most of their generation, things like that, so that you would need to fine tune it where you'd look, and hopefully on that list you'd have players, say like Jamarcus Russell. You would have guys who would fit that mold who weren't successful, but you'd just be looking, you're not thinking about who are these good guys that are that. You're looking at who are these guys that fit that mold, and you're including all of them, So, but I could understand how like what I brought up as an example, I'm bringing up 2 Hall of Fame players and
Right.
3 guys with MVPs. But what I was really looking for wasn't that. What I was looking for is, the list of guys where, like, Max Hall would not fit on the list with Anthony Richardson as a player archetype. But Jamarcus Russell might. Michael Vick might. Or someone who was... Or I can't think of players right off the bat because I'd have to look at the list some more. But players who washed out, who didn't have that success.
Right. And as you get more experienced at modeling and analysis, it's just like anything else. You get better with time, and you start to learn good practices. And there's things that you can do. Use objective sorting criteria as much as possible. Decide on your criteria before you look at the data. Don't go data snooping where you look at the data and you're like, all right, well, I want these guys, so I'm going to look at, like, hey, what filters can I use that will produce exactly the name?
Exactly.
So
you're manipulating it. Yeah.
Right. And then also too, it's important, even if you think you've done a good job, you know that what a list of comps should look like, and a plausible, genuine list of comps should have some hits and have some misses.
Yeah.
If you get a list of comps that has a 50 or 60% hit rate, that's favorable. That's a really good set of comps.
Yeah.
If you get a set of comps that has an 80 or 90% hit rate, you done screwed up.
Yeah.
Like, you messed up. Even if you made the best good faith effort you could, and you pre-registered all of your criteria and whatever, effects that strong don't exist in the NFL.
Yeah.
Relationships that strong don't exist in the NFL. There's too many variables that we're just incapable of capturing. And if you find something like that, it's not that you discovered this secret that nobody else has discovered.
Right.
It's that you screwed up. That is the most plausible explanation for the result. And yeah, as you get more experience with comps, I mean, like I'll create a list of player comps and I'm like, oh yeah, this is really good for this guy. And people who aren't used to seeing that will be like, oh, but look at all those trash players on the list. And I'm like, well, if you see a list of comps that doesn't have the trash players on the list, you should run. That's not a list you should trust.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So, I think this bleeds into a good part of what you talked about this week in your column about what qualifies as good work. And I think you gave some very good examples right now as to why I think people should trust what Adam has to say about a lot of work, because you could see that he's not giving you things with absolute certainty. He's showing you kind of the pitfalls of everything. He's willingly to just basically willing to admit to you that he likes doing statistical models and he likes doing different modeling, but at the same time, a lot of it, when it comes down to it, can be voodoo, and just cheerfully discuss that fact and understand, just in the same way that at the end of the day with draft work that I do, we all know that all of us have holes in what we do with our analysis and our knowledge. There's a lot beneath the iceberg that we don't see in terms of what makes a good player and what doesn't, and the film or looking at models or looking at data only give us some context, not all of it. And development tracks are unique, and development paths are unique for different players. So what fit, where each player fits is important. It's why, like, I look at statements like Jaden Daniels. We should probably, one of the things I saw this week was in regards to Anthony Richardson's benching was, he should have played a lot more than he did and stayed in college and got more reps, because that's why Jaden Daniels was successful. And I would argue that I see the argument there, but I would also argue that maybe Jaden Daniels is successful because he's in an offense that creates really very clear first read opportunities for him, with a lot of schemed looking plays, and then allowed him to be able to, and then he continued to grow with it. Not that he doesn't have skills to read the field. He's certainly shown that, and he's played very well. But there's more to the offensive support structure in Washington than there is in Indianapolis. And those offenses are different. And also what kind of development track these guys were put on behind the scenes. If I put Anthony Richardson in Washington, I don't think I would expect Jaden Daniels production, but I would not expect Indianapolis Anthony Richardson production either. So there's different things like that. But anyway, I'd like for you to talk to us a little bit more about, the fine line between maybe communicating confidence and certainty with analysis, fitting in within how you determine who to trust and what qualifies as good work.
Yeah, I think the confidence versus certainty thing's a very hard thing. We talked last year on the show, one episode. Drake London after week 1 had 0 catches, and everybody was like, Drake London's done, and there was a list of things that people were trading Drake London for in Dynasty, and one of them was Zay Flowers, who had he had a good game. I don't recall it being, I don't think it was like a huge game. He was like 8 for 86 or something, right? Yeah. It was one of those things where huge in PPR because he just got a bunch of schemed up dump off things, right? Where he's not like breaking down a defense, but he's like, okay, good. It's good that he's a part of their plan. Kind of similar to Isaiah Likely at the beginning of this year too. But there was a poll, Ryan McDowell on Twitter, Ryan Mick23. He does a lot of polls during the year about who would you prefer in Dynasty? Zay Flowers versus Brandon Ayuk, Zay Flowers versus Drake London, on and on. And the majority of people were picking Flowers after 1 week. And I responded to that poll and I said, I am begging you not to trade Drake London. And some people were like, people aren't really doing that. And I pulled up the list of trades that like, yeah, people are actually doing this. And other people were like, Drake London, there's no path to relevance ever again. Like, he's never going to get a target again in his career.
Desmond Ritter's always going to be there.
Right.
Yeah.
And will be the quarterback for the next 15 years. And yet also he's awful. But they're not going to change. Why would they change from Desmond Ritter? There's no path to production. And it's, a lot of the things that I was saying at the time that, like, we don't know what the path forward looks like. But
some of these statements sound like kids having tantrums in a grocery store,
Right.
I mean, it's crazy.
I think there's a very emotional thing where, like, I paid to acquire Drake London and I put him in my lineup and I got a 0 and now I hate him. We are mortal enemies. I will never again love Drake London. I will trade him for a bag of chips just so he knows what it feels like. Right? Like, I think there's a very emotional side to fantasy football, and I'm not dissing that. I love the emotional side.
It's like what my friend sent me just before the show, a Lewis Black routine about junior mints that he read in some comments page about how, essentially, I would play it if I could, but just essentially about how he hates junior mints because he had to mortgage a second home just to go to the movies so that he could get popcorn and get everything. And now these things are stuck in the box and he has to finger bang the box to basically get the junior mints out of here. And he looks like a complete asshat trying to do this. And on top of it, it looks like spooge is covered in chocolate, so it's like all this different stuff that he's saying that's just hilarious. And you can just totally see the comment sections of people who are upset with Drake London having the same kind of commentary.
Yeah, which in hindsight, I'm sure, it aged really well. How is Drake London ever going to get targets? Yeah. How is London ever going to get yards? I don't know.
I don't know. He's number 5 and Zay Flowers is 16th. That's all I know.
Yeah. And that, I always try to be careful about that too, that like, if you preferred Flowers before this week's games, okay, great. Use this as an opportunity to trade London for Flowers. Although I don't know, if you preferred Flowers to London before this week's games, I don't know why you didn't trade London for Flowers and extra before this week's games. I don't know why you would wait until now to trade him. But if you preferred London before this week's games and you're changing your mind after one game of action, that's not good process. And the most interesting comment I got on the whole, like, I'm begging you not to trade Drake London for Zay Flowers. He's like, oh, like, you're so sure of yourself. Like, you think there's no chance that Flowers becomes a better pro than London? And I'm like, I get that it reads that way. That's not what I'm saying. Like, I think there's probably like a 40% chance that Zay Flowers goes on to be a better NFL and Dynasty asset. Or at the time, that was my thought. Right now, like 40, 45%. Yeah. Very, very plausible. Like, barely worse than a coin flip that Flowers winds up being the better.
And just to interject, as of today, Zay Flowers, the difference between them is 4 touchdowns. That's really the difference. It's not that much. And if he goes on a little bit of a streak with touchdowns, and Drake London kind of has a little bit of a calm period of touchdowns, they could be very much even. But you're right. But the point you're making makes total sense,
Right. Even today, I would say there's a 40 to 45% chance that Zay Flowers goes on to be a better and more productive receiver over the next 10 years than Drake London. It's very, very plausible. I don't even think it's that unlikely. I think it's more likely that London is the guy, but it's not unlikely. But the thing is, I'm like 55% sure that London is the better play here. But I'm like 100% sure that the process that would lead you to bumping Flowers over London here is a bad process. Yeah. That you're not doing it for the right reasons.
Yep.
And that's the confidence that I want to project here. I'm not saying that, like, you would be an idiot to ever sell Drake London for anything. He's going to be a surefire first ballot Hall of Famer, whereas Zay Flowers is going to be the answer to a trivia question 20 years from now. No, I'm not saying that. And the problem with social media and with the internet and any sort of communication where you're stripped of nuance and stuff is it's hard to necessarily communicate that difference between confidence and certainty. And I get that that's on me as a writer and a creator to explain that nuance as best I can. But I do think that that's the important thing to remember. It's good to be confident, but it's also and you can be confident while recognizing that the margins are extremely slim. Like in football and in dynasty leagues, a 55 to 45 edge is massive. A 60-40 edge is gargantuan. If you can stack 55 to 45 edges, you have the most dominant team in your league. They just don't really exist in many places. And so the idea that somebody would willingly give up one of these rare 55-45 edges just based on an emotional reaction to one game rather than an objective evaluation of the actual prospects at play here, to me, that's unfathomable. That's malpractice.
And when you talk, I think the key here that I really pick up on, especially with my own work, is because I try to communicate things with confidence, and I'll occasionally get that feedback too, like, oh, you think you know everything. And it's really about, no, when I evaluate players, I have a process. And that process has yielded enough good results, which are more on the margins you're talking about, as opposed to like 100%, very far from 100%. But when you yield the same process that I think Skylar Thompson was one of the better prospects in this class at quarterback, or Trey Sermon was one of the better prospects at running back in this class, is the same one that I said, take Marshawn Lynch and he's almost as good as Adrian Peterson. Take Nick Chubb, he's better than Saquon Barkley. Take Lamar Jackson, he's a quarterback. He's one of the best pocket quarterbacks in this class. Take Patrick Mahomes. Here are guys that are going to have more trouble. I mean, it's the same process. I know that the outcome may have enough variability that it may not work out what I think, but I'm confident enough in the process to be able to tell you this is where I stand and have confidence in where I went about doing it, and knowing that, yeah, I'm going to have things to learn with my process, but it's different than going, well, I like Patrick Mahomes' hair, and what he said today, or, man, did you see that throw off that guy's knees? In his pro day, things that just.
Or he tapped out because he was tired, so therefore he doesn't have that fire.
He doesn't have that fire in him. Exactly. Yeah. That he wore his helmet kind of weird. He was
smiling on the sidelines. Yeah. How dare he?
Why is he talking?
Didn't sit stone-faced for 3 hours.
Why is he talking about philosophy rather than just skipping class or carving initials on his desk and refusing to be seen by media and expecting his tutors to actually cheat on tests for him? I don't know. Maybe we got it all wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's a good distinction too. Is I can be 90% confident in a process that produces 52 to 55% edges.
Yeah.
It's not. I'm not confident in the individual edges, but I'm confident that this process is a good process that will, over the long run, lead to more hits than misses. And it is very easy to confuse the two. And that kind of gets to one of the rarest things I see, but one of the biggest trust signs to me, where if I see somebody do this, I'm like, okay, this is a guy who I think is taking very seriously what they're doing here, and it makes me more likely to believe and trust in their work going forward. And that's, you see a lot of times when you have a good process and it leads to a bad outcome, and people are always looking to claim that okay, I was wrong. You're doing it here. And I don't think undeservedly. Perhaps I was wrong about Skylar Thompson, but the process is conceptually solid and will lead to good outcomes. The outcome was bad, but the process was good. And that's fair and accurate. But similarly, about the same percentage of time that good process will lead to bad outcomes, you should have bad process leading to good outcomes.
Yeah.
It should happen the exact same amount of time, just by definition of how we're defining good and bad here. But you almost never see somebody say, yeah, I was right about this player, but in hindsight, my process was terrible. I'm not going to do that again.
Yep.
I got really lucky there. I was completely wrong, and it bailed me out. Had Zay Flowers, had Drake London looked like he just wasn't a good player after that, and Zay Flowers had looked like a world beater, and we're sitting today and London was outproducing Flowers on this incredibly fluky production on gadget plays and whatever, or Flowers Like he wasn't producing because Baltimore spread the offense out too horizontally and it was sharing the targets too much. I might be sitting here today saying like, okay, yeah, in hindsight, Drake London has outproduced Zay Flowers, but I think I was wrong. I think I would prefer Zay Flowers now. And you never really see people say that. But to me, you have much more credibility to say, I was wrong, but for the right reasons, if I also occasionally see you say, I was right, but for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I think I don't know if it's a perfect example of this, but I remember I've talked a lot about like when I changed my wide receiver analysis. Like there was like 2 iterations of changes in the past 12 years, and the first one was after watching after like the year Keenan Allen was was in that class, and I still had him rated. He and DeAndre Hopkins rated rather high, but I had developed a different process, but I decided not to use it yet and stick with the one that I had, and they still ranked well, but it wasn't for the right reasons, and so that was one of the reasons why I ended up ultimately making the changes. Is I was testing out something new, but you have those things that you're right. I mean, it makes sense because you're not taking credit for everything as if it's correct. And you also, and like what you do also, I mean, you want to be able to say, look at things and say, okay, these things happen that I didn't think would happen, and here's where we go. I mean, I'm thinking about Alvin Kamara all the time. Like Alvin Kamara is one of my absolute favorite players. Alvin Kamara is one of the players that I looked at and said, nope, bounces things outside too much, doesn't hold on to the ball well, isn't going to change. Sean Payton even like, and then what was fun was Sean Payton when they drafted him was like, I don't like this kid on film because he bounces things out too much, and I don't think he like sticks it in there and plays tough. And I let him have it in his first camp, and again the whole idea of like player trajectories. There are a lot of players that they would never fix that. Wouldn't know where to start. Their ego would have been hurt. They might not have known what to do. They might have actually been afraid. So they were trying to, and they didn't know how to face it head on. Alvin Kamara's like, oh, this is what you want? Okay. And the rest is history, So, I mean, I hear you with a lot of that. And I think that, but I want to take note of that talking about right outcome, wrong process. I think that's a great one to remember.
It's also, I mean, you need to know that minds are not designed to be right; they're designed to be useful. And sometimes it's useful to be right, sometimes it's useful to not be right. But when we are wrong, but the process is sound, the mind is always motivated to justify itself. So when we're wrong, we're going to critically examine that. And we're going to, even if we're intellectually honest, we're going to critically examine our misses and say, did I miss for the right reasons or did I miss for the wrong reasons? And that's good. That's how we update our process and hopefully produce fewer misses going forward. That's important. But we don't have that same reflex to critically examine our hits. If something is right, we just say, well, okay, obviously the process must have been fine. I thought this would happen and it happened. So no further examination needed. And so I don't expect anybody to have as many instances of saying I was right for the wrong reasons as I was wrong for the right reasons, because the mind doesn't work that way. Nobody, even no matter how disciplined you are, you're never going to examine your hits with the same rigor and consistency as your misses. Yeah. But if I see somebody saying it, it tells me that like at least some of the time they are actually going deeper and they're not reflexively assuming that every hit just validates their process, right. that they're doing the work, and it's really, really hard and counterintuitive, and it does not come naturally to anybody. No. So when I see it happen, to me, this is a sign that like they have this huge bundle of related intellectual traits that I think in the long run are going to lead to better outcomes. That, I mean, it demonstrates a lot of humility, curiosity. It demonstrates a commitment to the truth and to seeking the truth and a desire to be right rather than be perceived as right, which everybody thinks they want to be right, but I find if you scratch the surface, it turns out that most people want to believe that they're right. They want to be seen as right. They want to have the comfort in knowing that they are right, which often involves not actually looking to see if you're actually right, because maybe there's a monster under that bed. If you never check, you never have to know.
Yep. Yeah. No, that's a fantastic point. No, I love this, and it's I think that one of the things I value about our conversations is to hear the clarity in which you discuss a lot of issues, and the way that you're able to draw upon a variety of things that you've read, experienced, and that are well outside the bounds of what the main topics of discussion are here, and be able to integrate them into what it applies to, for how people approach reading work here, or doing the work, or just being fantasy managers. And I got some really nice emails over the past 2 weeks that were talking about. We have a surgeon who listens, who said that there was a lot of things we've talked about in recent weeks that applied oddly to their jobs, and very specifically to their jobs, and things like that from people from various industries. So certainly a lot of what you bring to the table is very appropriate for why we're getting that kind of feedback, and it's valued.
Yeah, I don't really think it's that odd. Both because my approach. I'm somebody who suffered from borderline crippling ADHD my entire life, which means I bounced from interest to interest to interest, which is really bad for a lot of things, such as maintaining career success and things like that. But has had the side effect of it's left me with a very broad and diverse and entirely unconnected pool of knowledge. So I get opportunities to make connections that maybe other people would not. So to me, it's not surprising that like a lot of this stuff has carryover to other areas, because it's stuff that I'm taking from other areas. But also, I mean, you were saying earlier that sport is like a simulacra of war, and it is. But I think war is a simulacra of society, and everything is all, just representations, and we're pantomiming life in various forms, and it's our efforts of coming to terms with like the meaningless of existence, and to find our place in the world. Humanity, it's hard being a person, being a human, being a member of a society and a world, and we create all of these very artificial constructs to kind of make sense of that all. And sport, to me, is that artificial construct that I love. But people say like, oh, I want a sport that doesn't have any politics, and I'm like,
Good luck.
Sport is politics. Politics is life. Sport is life.
Yeah.
Like all of these things that we're doing, we're just recreating life in miniature or in some other medium. And so it's no surprise to me that all of these lessons from sport carry over to other areas. I think that's the entire point of sport. And it's a tool through which we seek meaning and we learn things about ourselves and our place in the world.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think what's fun, though, is because as someone who can relate to you about, being able to, searching for different things, trying a lot of different things, it's fun to look at those artificial constructs and be able to go, let's just cut through the bullshit of this and say, and be able to just talk about things in a way that everyone wishes they could do, but sometimes feel constricted from doing so. And a lot of people in their life, they appreciate, enjoy, at the right time, being able to say, look, removing all bullshit aside, this is what I think. People go, that's just so refreshing. Thank you for opening the window and airing out the room. There's a time and place, maybe not, not to do that, but this is a good time and place for us to be able to do so. And I think that it gives people an opportunity. Sometimes you do have to look around, and when people are kind of stuck and they're operating in the same kind of manner, week in and week out, and you can see that there's a level of restrictive thinking or based on fear or different feelings or feeling stuck to something that just doesn't work. It's nice to be able to just kind of say things how they are, and say, let's point out all the bullshit in this, because we all know it's there. The elephant's in the room. Let's open the door and let it walk out, and
Yeah, and it's
go from there.
It's all about understanding the relationships. To take it back to Anthony Richardson, the media is not your friend, HR is not your friend, but like genuinely, I feel this way. I'm sure you feel this way. Like you and I, we're friends. We're your friends. We want to be in your corner. We want this to be a comfortable place, and I'm sure that that's a lot of our appeal to the people who listen to us. But I think that's also, for me, that's a lot of the appeal of doing this for the people who listen to us, because I genuinely do want to. I crave that relationship, and I crave that validation we're talking about is very rare, and I don't really need it. But I do that connection. I would go so far as to say.
Yeah. No, I love these conversations, and I love that people respond to them and share things of their own, because it's nice to be able to share something with you, and I'll be like, what do you think of this? And you're like, yeah, I don't like this particular part of it, but here's where that, and you're just very straightforward, and so I feel like that we're both pretty straightforward people about a lot of things. And we you see us on Twitter, we make fun of each other a good bit, and do things like that, and we have a good time coming from different point of views of how we approach the analysis. And I certainly have learned a lot from Adam, and continue to, and this is my opportunity to be able to do that sometimes, because my bandwidth can be low with other things. So I find myself sometimes repeatedly bringing up things that we've talked about it maybe a year ago, or we talked about several episodes ago. But I figure if I'm wondering about it, I'm sure some of you are too, especially when we can apply new instances to it to ingrain the example once again of how that works. I mean, I'm sure I don't have a great example of it, but it's just like when on the Audible with Cecil Bloom and I, there would be things that we would repeat multiple times over the years, but with just different examples. And the first time doesn't always catch on, so we want to kind of give that example, give that opportunity too.
Yeah. It's nice too having, I say again, I'm just terribly ADHD, so it's nice too having like the regiment and the structure that, like, if I don't have the scheduled block of time where I'm going to come and talk about this stuff, then it's just not going to happen. So I always appreciate that aspect too, that you kind of, I'm not saying that you're necessarily the most organized person either, but it's nice to have that accountability there.
Sure. And I like that we can do, because this show's pretty loose. As we've talked about, usually a half hour before I type something at him and say, I'm thinking these topics, what do you got? And then he'll give me some topics, or we both go, I don't know, and then for 20 minutes we probably think about it a little bit, and we have things percolating, but we end up, we'll talk about it and kind of figure it out. And it's nice to have a loose podcast like this, because there are a lot of great podcasts out there that are super organized. Everything is very regimented, and fits all the different things formulaically to be what most people would look for. But to have the free flowing thing is fun. To me it's kind of like old school wrestling and new school professional wrestling, where the new school wrestlers put everything down on paper and they talk about every move that they're going to make, and the old school guys are kind of like, we're going to do 60 minutes Broadway, where we're just basically going to, we'll get into the turnbuckle and I'll tell you what we're going to do next, and we'll see how it takes shape. And that's kind of what we do here, and we appreciate you going along for the ride. You can find Adam, of course, at Football Guys, at Adam Harstad on X, at Matt Waldman on X, mattwaldman.com. And of course, at Football Guys, got some roundtables that are be coming out this afternoon, replacements tomorrow. Of course, rent a kicker, looking at kickers, looking at Dynasty film, Dynasty in theory, regression candidates, all of that great work that Adam does. And we'll see you next week.